Hi, I'm David Edelman, and welcome to On Consciousness. Today we're going to discuss some really fundamental issues in the science of consciousness, namely, how do we define consciousness? What does that term mean? There's a kind of a commonplace notion of what consciousness is, and most everybody is sort of familiar with that. But when it comes to the actual sort of hard-nosed scientific aspect, we really haven't come to any sort of consensus, or at least as far as I know, there's no real consensus as to what we mean when we invoke the term consciousness. So today I'm here with Jay Geed, and we're going to talk about this together. And Jay, why don't you sort of tell us a little bit about where you are in your research, where you are physically, and what you're actually doing these days.
Yeah, well, first, thanks, David, for letting me participate in this. And
Sure.
We all have different paths that we've taken to come to this study of consciousness. And my path has been looking at it from the development of the brain.
Right.
And so I'm a developmental neuroscientist. I'm a child, adolescent, and geriatric psychiatrist. By training, I'm chief of child and adolescent psychiatry here at UC San Diego, in Fukui University in Japan in robotics, and at Johns Hopkins in reproductive medicine. But what sort of ties together my interest has been the brain and how it changes throughout life, what sort of things influenced in good ways and in bad ways, and looking at the brain in health and illness. Yeah. And what permeates all of these interests is consciousness, which is one of the, in some ways, the most basic and simple notion, and also one of the most difficult to grasp.
Exactly. So I don't want to put you on the spot, because I'll probably do that later. But I do want to ask you about your intuition about consciousness, your intuition as a scientist, and particularly as a scientist who's studying the process of development. What does that term mean to you? What does it invoke in you when I say consciousness?
I think at some point from conception, and when the cells start dividing and some of those start becoming brain cells, and the brain grows from a few cells to 100 billion,
right.
At some point along that path, we have not conscious and then conscious.
Right.
And it seems like it might not be that difficult to to see. And after 30 years of doing this, I still don't have a lot of confidence in identifying what that would actually mean. My basic quest is I want to try to understand it from a neuroanatomy and neuro-function kind of standpoint. What would consciousness look like in a brain scanner and other types of imaging? What are we looking for, in a sense? And could I predict from basically the architecture and the anatomy, this could be conscious and this would not be able to be conscious?
So that's really interesting, because from a perspective that isn't developmental, from a sort of a normal sort of snapshot perspective, we think of consciousness in a particular way. And in fact, Bernie would suggest, Bernie has a sort of a favorite phrase that he sort of relegates to the notion of consciousness, which is the difference that makes a difference.
Yes.
And I talk about it as the special sauce, right? Because we know a fair amount about higher brain function. We know certainly a lot about memory, particularly the memory in humans, but really to a greater and greater degree, the notion of memory in different animals with relatively complex nervous systems, even animals with very simple nervous systems, which also speaks to your notion of, well, when do we cross that Rubicon from non-conscious processing to conscious processing? And one of the aspects that Bernie and, in fact, my late father delved into was certain brain states, certain behavioral states, actually, that have underlying brain states that are indicative, perhaps, of a difference that makes a difference. And one example might be the contrast between waking states and, say, a dreamless deep sleep. And the fact that we can observe through brain imaging, through a variety of techniques, we can observe a real difference in function there. When you look at a typical human who's in a normal waking state, you see a sort of a pattern of brain activity playing across the cortex, a lot of the cortex involved.
Yes, yeah.
But when that human, or even a non-human animal, certain mammals have been studied to the extent that we can say, well, they're doing something very similar. Their brains are doing something very similar from waking to sleep. But when a human or a non-human animal descends into deep sleep, we see dramatically different kind of pattern of brain activity in that human brain or that animal brain. And so we might see slow waves, we might see very regular delta waves at a certain point during deep sleep, which are characteristically not what you see during the normal waking state. So we can define a difference that way, but as you kind of intimated before, when we look at development, it's a different kind of a kettle of fish. But it may inform actually what you might want to look for if you're looking for the transition during development from, say a very young infant. And so, and of course this is debatable. Some people think, well, consciousness is there all along. And I think you mentioned to me the other day that if you look at, sort of fetal behavior in the womb, there's some glimmering of something that maybe looks like volitional action.
Yeah, it really sort of sums up my expertise in this area in the sense that for me, I can only ask the questions at this point.
Right.
For me, consciousness is more about questions than answers, even after 30 years of trying. But it does raise, the memory aspect is actually a really good place to start for me on that. So to what extent do babies in the womb have a memory? Right. And even after, in terms of at some point, it takes about 8 months before they can kind of remember that mom exists even when she's not there. Right. Some stranger anxiety and stuff. But that's kind of old, in terms of, and my sort of intuition is like, wow, babies are, at least in some version, conscious, before 8 months. Right. It kind of comes back to this difficulty of how do we precisely define. But I think it is an interesting aspect to what extent do you need to have memories to have a sense of your place in the world. It seems like there's some essential minimum that I can't get around, that you would need to have some memory in order to be conscious, to say I am me and you are you, and to what extent is it a small component of consciousness? To what extent is it the essence of? And can you have a severe amnesia, for instance, and still be conscious? Yes, I mean I think I'd still say conscious. And sleep as well is another great kind of lead-in terms of we become unconscious every day, or most days, right? In terms of we go to sleep at night. That's pretty striking. I've looked at sleep actually across different species, and it's remarkable that life on Earth sleeps. Even archaea, these organisms that never see sunlight, thousands of generations, they live off the thermal vent energy. And they have also the kind of this roughly 24-hour cycle of metabolism. It baffles me, because you could think as an animal, it'd be great if you didn't sleep. Either as a predator or as a prey, right?
It opens up a new vista, sort of 18 hours of your life.
Yeah, but nothing's pulled it off, in terms of even though it seems to be an obvious competitive advantage, so to speak. Even dolphins, or cephalid, which you've studied more extensively, fascinating, right? They can't go to sleep completely because they need to come back to get air.
Sleep,
and they half the brain at the time, right? That's so cool.
It's amazing.
And you can even tell, right? They circle and that, But even they would have such a great reason not to need to sleep, but even they find a way to get sleep.
That's right, and sleep is a particularly interesting case. Again, going back to Bernie's notion that you want to look for the difference that makes a difference. And the elegant aspect of sleep, to me at least, is the fact that it's variegated, it's multifaceted. It's not simply one thing, of course. When we talk about sleep, at least when it comes to human beings and non-human mammals.
As might be the case for consciousness.
Right. But it's really interesting because it offers a lot of opportunities for study. And one thing in particular that appeals to me is the idea that there is one form of sleep that a lot of consciousness researchers, I think, agree is a kind of a different flavor of consciousness. It is a form of consciousness, but the difference is it's not the brain interacting with the great big outside world. It's the brain sort of talking to itself. It's more or less cortex talking to itself. So there's another example. So now not only can we study the non-conscious phase of the brain, higher brain function, non-conscious states versus conscious states, we can also look for a different brand of consciousness that in fact more or less walls off the internal you or the brain from most of the rest of the sensory world. The brain is sort of feeding on itself. And so, and it is in a way, it's a wacky form of consciousness, right? In the sense that dreams can take these interesting twists and turns. But you're mostly not interacting so much with the outside world. There may be a little bit of stuff coming in the way of sounds influencing you, but for the most part, it's the brain, it's the cortex kind of talking to itself. So it's an intriguing.
I think it's absolutely critical, or this concept. And so I started out as a Freudian psychoanalyst, like many of my people of that generation, and that a lot was made of the interpretation of the dream. So Freud's. It's often misquoted. He didn't say that it was the royal road to the unconscious. He said the interpretation of the dreams.
Exactly.
Which is a little bit like the stone soup story. Whatever you kind of start with and put on the table, and you discuss, other things emerge, and as opposed to Carl Jung, who is more like, things mean things. Flying means one thing in a dream. Ships mean much more. I don't think it's that way. But we still don't have a really good idea of what dreams mean, and in terms of you can have mice run mazes and always turn right, and have another run maze and always turn left, and you can tell while they're dreaming which is which. Which is kind of neat in a sense that you're sort of unpacking what you learned that day. Sleep looks to be very important for consolidating memories, to study. It's good to sleep before the test, to kind of have the memories become more entrenched, and to the point where it can actually be better to sleep sometimes than to rehearse and study more, which is a bit surprising.